heat waves, drought, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, blizzards, bitter cold. Extreme weather has an incredible impact on people across the globe. On Mount Washington, our scientists brave some of the worst weather on the planet to improve our understanding of our warming world.
All right, good evening and welcome everyone to Mount Washington Observatory's Science in the Mountains series. My name is Brian Fitzgerald and I'm the Director of Science and Education here at Mount Washington Observatory. And with us this evening to tell us all about some of the earliest weather observing campaigns on Mount Washington is Dr. Peter Crane, who is Mount Washington Observatory's Curator of the Gladys Brooks Memorial Library. Thanks so much for joining tonight's program. For those of you who aren't already familiar with the observatory, we are a nonprofit member-supported organization with a mission to support our understanding of the forces that create Earth's weather and climate. And the way that we do that is by operating around the clock mountaintop summit weather station with 24/7, 365 weather observations, daily forecasting, educational programs, and research and product testing services. Again, we welcome everyone to the program this evening. Glad to have you with us. Hope that you have some questions already for our speaker this evening. And as you do have questions throughout the program, I'd welcome you to use the Q&A button that you can find on your Zoom video screen, just down right at the bottom there in the center. If you're joining us on Facebook this evening, thanks so much for joining us through that forum. We won't be able to answer your questions live during the program, though we will have our summit staff follow up with any lingering questions there. If you'd like to join us and ask questions live via Zoom next time, you can register over at mountwashington.org/SITM. All righty, well, we are going to go ahead and, excuse me, I've been sharing my screen. We will go ahead and launch some polls for this evening. I have a poll question, a series of poll questions here for all of you, including some questions from our speaker tonight. Curious for those of you who are joining on Zoom, and apologies if you won't be able to see this on Facebook this evening, but if you're joining via Zoom, we have 5 questions for everybody, including curious where you're joining us from this evening, and then some trivia questions as well. We're curious if you joined us before, but some questions from Dr. Crane himself. Curious, the first weather station on Mount Washington was established by, was it meteorologists, geologists, or astronomers? Next, the U.S. Army set up a weather station on Mount Washington in 1871 for what purposes? For strategic purposes, to test armaments in cold weather and windy conditions, or to assist the regional economy? And then lastly, last trivia question here, a late 19th century resident of Mount Washington summit was named what? Medford, Somerville, or Ticky? Just give you a few moments more to participate here. See quite a few of you getting some responses in, and we'll go ahead and share those results in just a few more seconds here. Give you about 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. We'll go ahead and share those results with everybody. Thanks so much for participating. Oh, New Hampshire represented very well. The Granite State is about 32% of all of you joining this evening. Thanks so much for joining. But we have great representation all throughout the New England states, including a close second by our folks down in the Bay State. And a number of you joining from outside the region as well, including even a couple folks from outside the country. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Glad to have you with us. Wow, 32% of you. First program, first Science in the Mountains program. Excited to have you join this evening. Hope you'll join us for future programs. It's a free monthly lecture series here with a number of great speakers in weather and climate topics. So hope you'll join us once again. And then for our trivia questions, Oh, more than half of you said geologists established the first weather station on Mount Washington. We'll have to see about that. The U.S. Army set up a weather station on Mount Washington in 1871 for what purposes? Most of you thought to test armaments in cold weather. And then lastly, pretty split on who you thought the late 19th century of Mount Washington summit was between Medford, Somerville, and Tiki. Well, I don't know. And in fact, I definitely don't know the answer to that. So we'll have to see from our speaker this evening. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speaker for tonight. Many of you familiar with his work and time with Mount Washington Observatory, Dr. Peter Crane. Peter, I'd love to have you join us. And hey, look at that. I can see you and maybe I can hear you too.
Well, I hope so, Brian. How are you doing this evening?
Excellent. This is great. I'm doing wonderful. Thanks so much for joining. We'd love to hear all about your program tonight. I know you're always a wealth of information, so please take it away.
Sure. Well, let's see. Without further ado, I'll just move on to, trying to share my screen here. I've been so involved in the 19th century, it's hard to work my way to the 21st century.
You're
But
doing
I'm
great, Peter. We can
doing
see
what
your
I can.
slides.
There we go.
Oh,
All righty.
perfect.
So, and my presentation, I've called it, They Led the Way. It's about 19th century weather observers on Mount Washington. So even though the observatory was started in 1932, still many years before that, there were those who were exploring the weather up on Mount Washington. Mount Washington, of course, is the highest peak in the northeastern United States with an elevation of 6,288 feet. And it has become a year-round attraction to adventurers of all sorts, with remarkable natural, historical, and geological interest. It's also of great meteorological interest, with extremes of cold, fog, precipitation, and wind, so extreme at times that some call it the home of the world's worst weather. Indeed, the upper slopes of Mount Washington and its neighbor peaks hold warning signs such as this, cautioning visitors against sometimes lethal conditions. Dozens of visitors have died in weather-related incidents. Today, the summit features a small colony of buildings occupied year-round by State Park and Mount Washington Observatory staff. But there was a time when only simple structures such as the 1852 Summit House could be found on the peak. Today, a mountain railway can reach the summit even in very difficult conditions. But today's biofuel locomotives are a far cry from the primitive wood-burning engines of the 1860s. Today, even in the depths of winter, snow tractors can ascend the mountain's auto road to service the summit operations. That's quite a change from 1861, when the first horse and buggy labored to ascend the rough carriage road to reach the summit. And today, felines are typical companions for the summit weather observers, adding a touch of animal warmth to a cold, natural environment. But at one time, it was canine companions that kept summit weather observers company, and who toted little kegs of a liquid that doubtless was used for medicinal purposes only. Today, it's possible to get weather data and other information about what's happening on top of the mountain instantly, year-round. But many years ago, there was a time when summit news appeared only seasonally and only in hard copy at the speed of a simple printing press, such as through Among the Clouds, a newspaper founded on the top of the mountain in 1877. Even the early scientists who made summit weather observations had to rely on a weather-vulnerable telegraph line, laboriously laid and maintained along the railroad tracks. The earliest weather observers had to lay prone on the ground with their handheld anemometer to measure the mountain's extreme winds. Even in the lifetime of the 1932 established observatory, technology has evolved from standard 3-cup anemometers, prey to icing and the power of very high and destructive winds, to specialized instruments adapted from aviation technology to provide accurate readings in very harsh conditions. And while today's observers on their time off can put on their skis to carve turns in the style of the 21st century, observers of yesteryear also enjoyed hours off recreation, but with snowshoes and simple sleds to take a break from their summit chores. Today's Mount Washington Observatory is almost fortress-like in its ability to withstand extreme icing and super hurricane winds. But the earliest weather station, first occupied in 1870, was a large wooden building, which presented quite a target for powerful summit gusts. And its 1874 successor, while more compact and wind-resistant, also became prey to the summit's harsh weather and was very stingy in providing comfort to its occupants. The first winter occupation of the summit of Mount Washington for scientific purposes was accomplished in the winter of 1870 and 71. The two people most responsible for this remarkable achievement were Charles Hitchcock and Joshua Huntington. These two were not meteorologists, but geologists who were involved in the New Hampshire Geological Survey. With wide-ranging interests in earth sciences, they were keen to learn more about what was presumed to be incredibly severe weather on the state's loftiest peak. By 1870, the top of Mount Washington was well known in the summertime. The first recorded ascent of the mountain was in 1642, and in the subsequent years, foot trails, bridle paths, a carriage road, and a railroad had all been built to ease access. Simple summit structures had been erected, such as the first summit house, built in 1852, and the tip-top house, built in 1853. They both offered very basic overnight accommodations in the summertime. While Nathaniel Noyes had documented one summer's worth of weather on the mountain in 1854, there had barely been any visits to the summit in winter up until 1870, let alone extended stays in the coldest season. In 1860, the Smithsonian Institution had expressed interest in learning more about Mount Washington's weather, but no serious project arose from that interest. Hitchcock and Huntington hoped to establish a weather station on Mount Washington in the winter of 1869-70, but they were, at that time, unable to secure the use of a summit building on the mountain. However, they were able to use this building, the Prospect House, at the summit of Mount Moosilauke, almost 5,000 feet high in the western White Mountains, for a 2-month trial effort in that winter. Along with Huntington in the Moosilauke summit occupation was local photographer Amos Clef, an enthusiastic outdoors person who shared the trials and tribulations of time on the stormy mountaintop with the geologist. It proved to be good training for Mount Washington. In the following summer, that of 1870, Huntington and Hitchcock made definitive plans to establish a weather station atop Mount Washington, grappling with many challenging facets of such an enterprise, logistical, financial, and personnel related. Here, a fundraising flyer seeking support for their efforts for the benefit of commerce, as they said, recognizing that better knowledge of higher altitude atmospheric conditions could help in forecasting incoming weather that would affect especially maritime transportation, so critical to the economy of the era. And this copy of the flyer was personalized by one of the expedition participants, Howard Kimble, a photographer who worked side by side with Clef. Professor Hitchcock informs me that I must raise $100 or $200 for my share, wrote Kimble to a potential donor. I guess we can call this a 19th century equivalent of a GoFundMe page. Critical in its support was the Mount Washington Cog Railway, which allowed the expedition to use its new Summit Depot, which served as weather station and crew quarters. The cog also provided some transportation of supplies and equipment and allowed its tracks to carry the essential telegraph line to connect the summit crew with the valley below. Here are the members of that bold endeavor. From left to right, Sergeant Theodore Smith of the U.S. Army Signal Service detailed to the expedition, Solomon Nelson, Kimble, Clef, and Huntington. Nelson, a farmer from Georgetown, Massachusetts, was instrumental in raising funds for the expedition. Hitchcock served as liaison for the expedition from his office at Dartmouth College in Hanover, relying on the telegraph to stay in contact with the summit crew. The Summit Railroad Depot was a massive building. The weather station was only a small structure tucked into an inside corner of the building. The building is constructed wholly of wood. It is 60 feet long by 22 feet wide and stands nearly north and south. It has 11 feet posts, and the elevation of the ridgepole is 25 feet. With 60 feet of length and 22 feet of width, there was plenty of surface to the wind, perhaps too much, as time would tell. With ice and wind wreaking havoc on normal doors, the crew entered the building via a small hole in a leeward wall, covered with a blanket and secured with a board at nighttime. Here, Sergeant Smith stands with a simple anemometer. Inside the weather station, space was very tight, with 2 coal-burning stoves, weather and other work equipment, food, cooking essentials, and personal gear and clothing crowding the small space. This is one of many photographs taken by the partnership of Amos Clef and Howard Kimble, who jointly produced a series of stereographs illustrating the winter's work and the summit scenery. The apartment occupied by the party is a room about 20 feet long, 11 feet wide, and 8 feet high. The inside of the outer walls was covered first with tarred paper, then with boards. A layer of sheathing paper was added, and wallpaper was spread upon this. The ceiling is formed of 2 thicknesses of board with sheathing paper between. In this brief description of the space, note that there is no mention of any meaningful insulation. Though a small space, it was doubtless hard to keep even marginally warm at times of sub-zero temperatures and super hurricane winds. Here is an artist's conception of the place, with the clutter of real life removed. And here a visitor's comment on the multifaceted space. The little snuggery is made to serve not only as a kitchen, dining room, sleeping room, parlor, library, and study, but also as an observatory and telegraph office. Every inch of space is utilized. They all complain that it is the easiest place to lose anything in they ever saw. Clef and Kimble enjoyed making photographs of the rime-covered summit as well as of the distant landscapes, though Mount Washington's typical stormy, windy, fog-shrouded weather limited their opportunities. The duo spent some but not all of the winter on the mountain, descending to tend to their valley businesses and escaping prolonged conditions that were not cooperative with their artistic craft. Rime ice on the summit and peekaboo clouds over the valleys provided photogenic scenes for their efforts. And the curiosity of a building covered with rime ice, this the 1853 tip-top house, which still stands today, also encouraged their endeavors. When weather observers brave the elements to measure the wind, photographers brave the elements to capture the moment on film. Mounts Adams and Madison are in the background of this image. And the photographers traveled around the summit to record visual images of the natural and human scenery, rime-covered rocks, buildings, and tracks. Looking southeast, down the summit cone, past Tuckerman Ravine. Occasionally in the expedition records, Huntington or others would offer their sentiments about the experience. Early in the winter, when he kept a solitary watch, awaiting the arrival of others in the party, he wrote, "Have been above the clouds all day long. In every direction was this illimitable sea of clouds. Being here alone, one has nothing to do but to contemplate this immensity of space, bounded only by the sky." There were interesting optical phenomena, such as this corona also known as the specter of the Brocken. And interesting meteorological phenomena, including rime ice formed by tiny supercooled droplets of water below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but kept liquid in the clouds and freezing as they hit summit surfaces. Their records of weather observations attested to their willingness to be active in remarkably cold, windy, and foggy weather. Lowest recorded temperature was minus 59 degrees Fahrenheit, though Hitchcock noted that the mercury thermometer was unreliable below minus 38. Peak measured wind was 105 miles per hour, but the crew estimated that winds had exceeded that figure, perhaps to 120 miles per hour. Here are two examples of Clef and Kimble stereo views, sporting double images which could be seen to a 3D effect with a simple handheld viewer. Dozens of different views were taken, but even substantial efforts today have not resulted in finding surviving examples of all of the views. The Hitchcock-Huntington expedition left the summit in May of 1871 after a safe and successful winter. Thanks to their pioneer efforts, the U.S. Army Signal Service opted to pick up the baton from them and to continue their work of weather observation on the summit, working, of course, for the benefit of commerce. Without resident photographers, the efforts of the soldiers of the Signal Service are not as well chronicled visually as those of their predecessors. Here, one scene of such soldiers. And here another outside the old depot. In 1874, a new, more compact building was erected for the use of the Signal Service on the summit. It was small and reasonably sturdy, though in its later years, soldiers reported that it was leaky and drafty. Inside the small structure, the scene was not too different from that of the earlier expedition, with two coal-burning stoves, household items and personal items, and weather instruments filling most of the available space. Here, another interior view, apparently on laundry day. Like the rest of the summit structures, the signal station spent much of the winter covered with a coating of stucco-like rime ice, which doubtless helped keep its shingles from flying off in fierce winds. There are a few documents and photos which help flesh out the lives of these summit soldiers, such as Gil Linsley. He served on the summit from 1878 to 1882. Here you see him in his winter attire, long before Gore-Tex parkas, down-filled jackets, and plastic insulated boots were available. It was leather, canvas, and wool that protected these soldiers from exposure to the elements. Here is Linsley's drawing of the station taken from a letter home, now in the observatory archives. The letter includes a reference to Jerry the cat, who was frightened at the roar of the wind, a forerunner to today's Nimbus, the summit's current feline mascot, who perhaps pays less attention to the sound of the wind and more to the sound of the refrigerator door opening. There was no internet or email back then. This stereo view is titled Observers Returning with the Mail, only arriving after an arduous hike up on or along the Cog Railway tracks, a very exposed but direct route from the valley to the summit. Here, observers taking water, perhaps a humorous reference to thermal baths and taking the waters, but it seems they were either taking some water from this summit tank early in the season before it was frozen, or more likely harvesting frost feathers to melt on their coal stove. Indeed, here is an image of soldiers using an axe to harvest frost feathers for melting. You can see the spinning anemometer atop the station on the right. Unlike today, there were no electrically heated anemometers, so that wind instrument would only be exposed for a few minutes to the wind and icing conditions to get a reading, and then brought back to a sheltered location inside. This little perch on the gable end of the station served as a location for instrument exposure. There are many instances of the high winds being too much for the relatively frail anemometers, with resultant damage or loss. Another view of the station. The hefty timber supports helped buttress the building against the wind. When the wind swept over the summit, blowing blinding snow and adding a chilling effect to the already frigid temperatures, it must have seemed like a very desolate place. Not an assignment for the faint of heart. This photo shows the second summit house, a large hotel opened in 1873, plus a hint of an observation tower which existed on the summit for a relatively short time. There was no Peloton or Bowflex for these observers, but this photo was titled The Observer's Gymnasium, a whimsical use for open space beneath the cog railway tracks. I mentioned Jerry, an early summit cat, but there was also Medford, a summit canine companion. He was perhaps named Medford after Medford Old Rum, a regionally well-known spirit. We've already seen a photo featuring Medford with a cask hanging on his neck. Medford spent winters with the soldiers of the Signal Service, but reportedly sauntered to the Summit Hotel when it opened in the summertime, doubtless preferring the food there to the soldiers' rations. The signal station in summertime, including what appear to be employees of the Summit Hotel in their pinafores. Some records of the Signal Service have survived and are archived at places such as the Observatory and the Boston Public Library. These typed versions of those records were copied from the originals by Bob Monahan, who worked with Joe Dodge to re-establish a Summit weather station in 1932. In December 1876, a temperature to 40 below and winds to 180 miles per hour. 'Tis a fearful night. In January 1878, a peak gust of 186 miles per hour. In January 1885, a temperature of 50 below and winds of 110 miles per hour. And a storm in March of 1876 was so strong that it destroyed the railroad depot, which had once housed the Huntington-Hitchcock Expedition. Some of the earliest documentation of weather occurrences was relatively simple. Here, from the first year of Signal Service occupation in 1871, a daily listing of barometric pressure, temperature, and precipitation. But note the long official title of the enterprise: War Department, Signal Service, U.S. Army, Division of Telegrams and Reports for the benefit of commerce. And indeed, the purpose of the Signal Service as it was first instituted with respect to its weather work was indeed to help assist the economy of the United States of America. 10 years later, more detailed information about the summit's daily weather was recorded, with some readings taken 6 times a day. This image shows part 1, and this is part 2 of that particular data sheet. And here, part of a monthly summary, not unlike records which are kept even today. Here is data from the annual summary for 1882-83. This period saw a high temperature of 65.5 degrees and a low of minus 34 degrees. In addition to weather records, miscellaneous documents from that era survive, such as this listing of Signal Service property at the summit dating from 1872. It includes not only weather instruments, but also pens, pencils, envelopes, and red tape. I suppose being a government activity, that was essential too. Documents such as this one help paint a picture, however limited, of the station and life there. A station which had 1 complete stove, 2 camp stools, no brooms or spittoons, and 2 tons of coal. Data collected atop Mount Washington was of interest to other meteorologists around the world, and for instance, it was used in this 1875 scientific article from Austria about the physics of the upper atmosphere. The inherent drama of the long occupation of the summit also attracted popular interest in various books and magazines. Here, an observer is asked about the perils of a winter storm. The author asked, "So then for all those hours you expected from one moment to another to be swept into eternity?" Very dramatic, but so was the weather on Mount Washington. The alien appearance of the rime-covered ice summit and weather station was grist for the mill of numerous illustrators. Here are a few images of the mountain, including 3 of the signal station from an issue of Harper's Weekly of 1882. The text notes, "An Arctic solitude reigns over the whole region, and the men are cut off from contact with their fellows as effectually as if they were frozen up in a ship in the polar seas." And here are the same images, later hand-tinted, reproduced in a London magazine in that same year. Sadly, 3 members of the Signal Service who worked on Mount Washington died in the course of their service to our country: William Stevens, William Seeley, and Winfield Scott Jewell. Private William Stevens died of an apparent stroke in February 1872. As his sole companion, Sergeant Hearn, wrote, "Stevens is dead, and I am alone on the mountain." And it was a couple of days before a relief crew could come to remove Stevens' body. Another observer fell prey to the perils of the slide board, a rudimentary device used to get down the railroad tracks in a hurry. Private William Seeley lost control of the slide board during a descent of the mountain in the summer of 1873 and suffered fatal injuries. A third Mount Washington soldier died not on the mountain, but far, far away in the Canadian Arctic. Winfield Scott Jewell worked on the summit, but later served in the ill-fated Lady Franklin Bay Expedition to Ellesmere Island, perishing there in April of 1884. He, like many of his comrades, succumbed to starvation and disease on that harrowing adventure. The Jewell Trail on the western slope of Mount Washington is named in his honor. The signal station was operated year-round into 1887, and then, as government budget cuts came into play, was just opened for summertime use into 1892, when it was closed permanently. The derelict station was one of several buildings on the summit when this engraving was created circa 1902. The station is number 7, closest to the bottom of the image. Sad to say, most of those buildings were destroyed in an accidental fire which swept the summit in June of 1908. But I'm glad to say that is not the end of our story. Mount Washington's fascinating natural environment, its dramatic weather, and its history of scientific occupation beckoned further exploration. And so in 1932, a small band of adventurers, Alex Mackenzie, Bob Monahan, Joe Dodge, and Sal Pagliuca, here holding Tiki the cat, once again established a weather station on the summit. At first, it was intended to serve for 1 year only, but it persists to this day. That first crew was fortunate to have the assistance of the Mount Washington Carriage Road, which allowed use of its summit stage office for the weather station. A humble building, but an important one, not unlike the signal station that had once stood nearby. Bob Monahan fully acknowledged the inspiration that the earlier weather observers had provided to the 1932 crew, and titled his book about that first winter, Mount Washington Reoccupied, honoring the previous occupation by the Huntington-Hitchcock Expedition and the many years of faithful duty by the Signal Service. As in days gone by, cold temperatures, heavy icing, and fierce winds scoured the summit. And on April 12, 1934, a remarkable storm swept over Mount Washington, yielding an almost unbelievable wind of 231 miles per hour, which stood as a world record for many decades. The accurate recording of this wind was a tribute to the hard work and boldness of the crew. And it occurred 50 years to the day after the death of their predecessor, Winfield Scott Jewell, in the unforgiving Canadian Arctic. By 1937, use of a borrowed building was not sufficient for the observatory's needs, and a new structure was built on the summit with the support of the cog railway. Built with railroad trestle timbers, some called it the strongest wooden building on Earth. Here, the old obs, covered as it often was with rime ice, a gift of the clouds, the cold, and the wind. It was estimated that over the lifetime of this building, from 1937 to 1980, more than 13 million miles of wind passed over it. In 1980, new quarters for the observatory were established in the New Hampshire State Park's Sherman Adams Summit building. There are those of us who still call this the new building, though now it has stood on the summit for more than 40 years. And from this tower, today's observers, like the many before them, keep watch on the mountain's weather for forecasting purposes, for aviation safety, to aid visitors to the mountain's regions, and to help better understand the complexities of our planet's weather and climate. Those who work in and visit the observatory today stand on broad shoulders. The shoulders of those many early observers who, with their dedication and courage, led the way for the observatory of today. So thank you very much. I appreciate your participation this evening, and now I'll hand it back to Brian.
Wow, thank you so much, Peter. That was excellent, excellent, excellent. In fact, I know I have, I learned a number of things in there that maybe I'll have to bug you another time, not during a live program about. But now is a great opportunity for questions. I know we have some questions already, Peter, in the Q&A right now, and I'll remind folks if you do have any questions for Peter related to the program this evening, feel free to use the Q&A button. You can find it at the bottom of your Zoom video screen there. And again, if you're joining us on Facebook, apologies, won't be able to get to your question most likely this evening, but we'll follow up and make sure to get some answers your way. Well, let's kick things off. We have a number of different questions. I know you mentioned it briefly a little bit earlier on. I was wondering if you can expand on this topic around clothing a little bit more and some of the different clothing styles, maybe some of the more unusual styles. Vanessa asked a question just more generally. What do they wear when they're going outside, generally, some of the folks you've talked about?
Well, so often those details of day-to-day life were not preserved for us to be able to know today. We have to extrapolate from things like photographs or whatever other records existed at the time that may have made their way to us. Probably pretty simple stuff, probably a lot of wool, sweaters, jackets, trousers of various types. Certainly nothing as advanced as what we have today. Although in the lifetime of today's observatory, going back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, there were times when various new items were tested. Brian, you and I spoke before the presentation about a reference from, I believe it was 1934, on an especially cold day, where folks using enough insulation and good wind gear claimed that they were quite comfortable being outside at temperatures well below zero and some hefty winds. But I would say that this would be a good subject for someone who wants to do some sartorial research, whether you're looking at signal service, early military information, or just typical vernacular clothing of the era. So a good question. I wish I had a better answer.
Certainly, and I know we do, at least from, I believe, the 30s and onward, do have some clothing on loan to the observatory, but maybe that will beyond that, which would be really fascinating to see.
Yeah.
I have a question here from Kevin, which is an interesting one. Kevin asks, what's the longest length of service by someone on the summit? Do you have any indication of that, Peter?
Well, let's see. Looking back, if I recall correctly, some of the Signal Service information, it looked like 4 or 5 years for that assignment. Might have been as long as anyone. Looking at records of today's observatory, there are folks who actually worked for 20, 30, 35 years. Some of those people working part of the time on this, or for part of their service on the summit, and then, if you will, being kicked downstairs and having more of a managerial role, but with regular return to the summit. One of the challenges about working on top of Mount Washington, as a former employer once told me, is that when you're on the highest peak in the Northeast, it really limits your upward mobility. But if we look at the history of the observatory, I would say there tends to be a fair amount of turnover. And I think because while it's an exciting opportunity, it's, to use a sometimes overused word, unique in the Northeast. It also has a lot of personal challenges because most people aren't away from family and friends for a week at a time, week in, week out. And that can be challenging for folks. So certainly turnover is fairly typical, but we have had folks within the last 40 or 50 years who've worked for a decade or longer. And I think right now we have Ryan Knapp, who's been on the summit 11 or more years, I think.
16.
16.
Yeah,
And,
so
and
he's certainly up there in contention.
And we thank him for his continuing service.
Absolutely. Well, Peter, another question here from John, and perhaps a good plug for the services you help provide in the Gladys Books Memorial Library. John's curious where Signal Corps, he asked specifically where are the Signal Corps photos today, but I wonder if he also might mean Signal Service photos and what might be available either in the library at the observatory here, but also elsewhere in your knowledge.
Sure. I would say any of the Signal Service photos that we have here, I think they are all from stereo views, typically from the Kilburn brothers from Littleton, not unlike some of the Clef and Kimble views. But there is not a great or readily available photographic source. I think if one wanted to hunt this down, probably the best place would indeed be the National Archives, and might have some success finding more photographs there. But of course, with Mount Washington's typical conditions being away from civilization, if you will, and also with the very harsh weather, I wouldn't expect to find a huge trove, but you never know.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, certainly maybe a bit dispersed, but fortunate that we have a number of resources available here to be able to share, which is certainly a great asset. This is a question from a former observer, actually.
Yes.
Former observer Nicole. Nicole wonders, was Medford the only known canine companion on the summit? And I know I'm curious too. I believe I've heard of others, perhaps.
Well, I have heard of some others, but they seem to have had a relatively short tenure. There was, one dog that I think was Joe Dodge's Hayu Skookum, who might have spent a little bit of time up on the summit. But I think there's not just a canine issue, but potentially a human issue. And I'll try to be delicate about this. Cats can take care of business inside pretty well, but typically dogs don't. And there can be some pretty rugged conditions for taking a dog out for a walk up there in the wintertime. As nice as it would be at times to have canine companion. I remember one state park employee who occasionally would have his dog Red visiting, who was always a welcome visitor. But certainly cats have been much more common than dogs over the years.
Yes, I think I'm vaguely familiar of a husky in the early years of Mount Washington Observatory that didn't stick around for very long, and I think made a good friend in the town of Gorham or something like that. I think was enjoyed town a little bit more than the harsh mountain peak.
Yes, yes.
Well, sticking, I think maybe unfortunately on a similar subject here, Pete's curious about what was the outhouse or latrine situation like for these observers in the early days. I'm assuming no flush toilets or any of the engineering marvels that we are fortunate to have on the summit today.
Well, again, that's one of those fine details that so far has not surfaced in the historical record. For instance, in the official book produced by the Huntington-Hitchcock Expedition, there's actually absolutely no reference to that sort of day-to-day activity. So, if you will, we can't be privy to those details.
Oh,
How, ouch. But because what I assume is because the depot was such a large building, because the living quarters was such a small part of that, I assume that they probably outfitted part of the depot with some of the basics and probably had some place to dispose of things outdoors when the weather allowed. I don't believe that the signal service sketch indicated a privy, but I should take a closer look. One thing I will note, though, is back in 1937, when the first building specifically for today's observatory was built on the summit, there was a chemical toilet that was installed in that, a so-called Costine toilet. So at least by 1937, folks were giving that sufficient thought.
oh, well, this sounds like another area certainly that could use some additional research, perhaps a small book of some kind.
Yes.
A question here from Sandy, who is curious. I think in some of the data sheets that you showed from the signal service and elsewhere, when those temperatures are shown on the data sheets, do they include wind chill? And I guess sort of more broadly, I'm curious too, what were some of the other data types that they were capturing there? Because I've glanced at just a few of these sheets and kind of interesting, not necessarily the same type of data or format as the observers are collecting today.
I'd say in large part it was quite similar. Things like barometric pressure, wind direction, wind speed, dew point, temperature, maxima and minima. Wind chill would not have been included, but I think here is another question. I know that it was Paul Seipel, I think back in the 1950s in Antarctica, who was one of the earliest people to really explore that concept. Even though folks don't, as long as there have been people, wind, and cold temperatures, people have probably figured that one out. But one thing that I think I should do is maybe see if I can do a guest blog on the observer's blog on the observatory website, and maybe pull out a few of these sheets, go into a little more detail with that. So if that's okay with you, Brian, I'll work on that to provide a more comprehensive response to that question.
That would be great, because I know we did receive in the mail, actually, we get all sorts of wonderful letters and interesting things in the mail. And we even received a scientific report, some of the earliest, well, not some of the earliest, one of the revisions of the current wind chill calculations, a scientific study that was conducted some years ago to update that model and calculation. And they thought maybe Mount Washington Observatory folks would be interested in wind chill calculations.
Yes, yes.
Good question from Anonymous here. Have there been women serving as weather observers? And I'll even add to that, what are some of the earliest involvements of women that you know of in weather observing on Mount Washington?
Sure. To the best of my knowledge, the first woman who did do some weather observing at the summit was working for today's observatory back in the 1950s, a woman named Lorna Ridley. And she was working at the Summit House, but also working part-time, taking weather observations as more or less a fill-in basis. She later worked for the Blue Hill Observatory, and then she went to Penn State and got her master's degree in meteorology. Later worked for the National Weather Service in Alaska. eventually retired to New Hampshire, and sad to say, did pass away a few years ago. But she really was the first. Beyond that, I believe it took quite a while for women to become more regular participants in the summit work of the observatory, sometimes working in the museum as interns, but then eventually, thank goodness, as full-fledged observers. And it's not every day that I quote Mao Zedong, but he once said, "Women hold up half the sky," and women also can help us observe the sky and the significance of the things that take place within that. So I'm glad that we've reached that point in our evolution.
Yes, and certainly seeing a lot more interest in our summit-based positions these days. Even the internship program, certainly a greater proportion of more diverse representation in the physical sciences, which is great to see. A question here from Patrick, who's curious. You mentioned rations and things like that. What were some of the provisions and rations like? What did these folks eat back in the day, so to speak?
Again, that's something where the historical record is pretty sketchy thus far, at least as far as things that have really come to light in the documentation related to the first winter on Mount Washington. Sometimes they had some delicacies like, I think, chicken or turkey that had come up, that had been brought up. But typically it was probably pretty basic New England country fare. There are references to coffee, hardtack, bully beef, or canned beef, and so forth. So I don't imagine they had gourmet fare. By the time in the 1930s, when today's observatory was established, one of the principals in establishing it was Joe Dodge, who worked for the Appalachian Mountain Club, and he had pre-existing relationships with various food purveyors, including S.S. Pierce of the Boston area. And so S.S. Pierce canned food often was on the shelves of the observatory. Some things were donated, some were purchased. And let's see, I think it was also Friends Beans at one point made a donation, and then the observatory was mentioned in some of their advertising and so forth. But back in the olden days, I'd say probably pretty simple, pretty basic food.
Yeah, yeah. Limitations for sure.
Yes.
I guess
Yes.
maybe not quite as romantic as some of us might envision. Although some of the quotes you laid out, particularly the certainly in some ways the summit being more connected today, but a lot of those writings about the idea of solitude up on top of the mountain, boy, I think those still ring true today, even if we are a bit more connected.
Yeah.
Interesting. A question here from Rebecca. Rebecca's wondering, you mentioned that the mail arrived in winter via hiking up the cog pathway.
Yes.
When did services for the OBS crew start using the carriage auto road?
That would have been really with the 1932 effort. Some of the supplies were brought up before winter set in. There's one photograph taken, I think, by Winston Pote of a small convoy of vehicles bringing things up in October of 1932. And there certainly are records of people coming up from that side of the mountain in the 1930s and then on. I think a few things that really encouraged that. One is Joe Dodge's presence at the AMC in Pinkham Notch. I think it was about 1926 that they started keeping that open year round. Also, the Glen House was located at the base of the Mount Washington Auto Road. By then, it was just a very small hotel, but still could be at least a basic base of winter operations. And by the time skiing became popular in that era, if you had good conditions, you could ski up, or at least a halfway in reasonable conditions, and make a quick trip skiing down. So by the 1930s, it seemed that as far as supplies and equipment, um, were more likely to come up from the eastern side than the western side.
Yeah, and certainly while the observatory today does use the auto road with as sort of the primary mode of transportation of goods and services, there's still obviously an important connection with the Cog Railway, and they continue to help us out and shuttle people and supplies and other things up and down, which is wonderful.
Yes.
All right, I think a couple more questions here as we're kind of running up to the top of the hour. Question here from Joel, who says, "Hi, Peter. Does the Signal Corps, not too confused with the Signal Service you've been talking about, the Signal Corps site above halfway on the auto road fit? How does that fit into the history of weather observations on Mount Washington?"
Hello, Joel, and hello, Gene. Also, I was able to get a picture. I think it was from Bruce Sloat of the Signal Corps building that once existed at a site just a little bit above halfway, just a little bit above tree line, right alongside the Mount Washington Auto Road. And that is the site that even today is still referred to as Signal Corps. And I believe it was in the 1950s that for a relatively short period of time, there was a building there operated by the Signal Corps, and that was in association with developing or attempting to develop some remote weather stations. Of course, in the starting in the early 1940s into the early 1960s, there was quite a bit of military or military-related research on Mount Washington. Some of that directly involved members of various branches of the military, including the Army and its Quartermaster Corps. But there were also quite a few civilian contractors working for the military, especially doing icing research related to aviation. Back at that time, of course, we had the recent experience with World War II. As we got into the 50s, we had the Korean War. With less than ideal relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, realized there was a lot of very cold terrain between us and them, and it served us well to learn more about how aircraft could be protected from some of the perils of icing. So various jet engines, jet bodies themselves, helicopters were tested on Mount Washington.
Yeah, there's some great historical images that exist of those that are hard to fathom. Particularly the big buildings just below the summit cone there, which very nicely you'd never know that they ever existed there today. Well, all right, just one last question for you, Peter, and hopefully a good way to wrap up here. Diane says, "Hi, wonderful presentation. Love all the historical slides and pictures. Is there a book that would give us a chance to look over these in a conglomerate sort of way in more detail?" And I guess I'll just expand on that. What recommended reading or resources for folks who would like to learn more about the early days on Mount Washington, some of the history there, might you recommend?
All right. I don't think there's too much that is likely to be found in print these days. However, there are a few exceptions. And also, if you take a look either at your local library or through interlibrary loan, or if you want to make a purchase through Amazon or ABE Books or A-Libris, some of the various used book sites, there are some opportunities. One book that came out recently is called In Search of Amos Clef, which is about that photographer who spent time on Moose Lock and also spent time on Mount Washington. It's a wonderfully illustrated book, so something worth considering there. To give more general background in White Mountain history, two older books that are worth considering. One from 1916 called Chronicles of the White Mountains by Frederick Kilbourne, and that's an overview of White Mountain history to that time, including mention of Mount Washington and the Summit Colony and weather observing. A more recent book, but one that's still quite a few decades old, by Frank H. Burt, called The Story of Mount Washington. So that's a book that, especially for New Hampshire folks, you can probably find that, if not in your library, then through interlibrary loan. a book by William Lowell Putnam called The Worst Weather on Earth, which is a very wide-ranging history of weather observing on Mount Washington, including not just today's observatory, but the predecessors whom we discussed tonight. You also have, again, possibly available through a library, and it was reprinted probably about 40 years ago, book just called Mount Washington in Winter, which is the chronicle of the 1870-71 expedition. Not to be confused with another picture book by Winston Pote, photographer, called Mount Washington in Winter. Let's see, another book, again, either available through a used book dealer or a good library, is Bob Monahan's Mount Washington Reoccupied, which is the chronicle of the 1932-1933 start of today's Mount Washington Observatory.
Excellent. I'm sure that's just the iceberg there in terms of White Mountain history. I know there are a lot of great reads out there, but I certainly appreciate you sharing those resources. And for anyone who didn't catch that, feel free, you can reach out to us directly and help to recommend titles to anyone who's interested in learning more. All right, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate you taking the time to present this evening and for sharing your knowledge of the history of Mount Washington and early weather observing. Thanks to all of you for joining tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's free program, we'd strongly encourage you to make a donation to help support free programs like these over at mountwashington.org and hit the donate button in the upper right-hand corner of the website there. Don't forget, any donation in any amount also makes you a member of the Mount Washington Observatory. If you have any thoughts about tonight's program or suggestions for future programs or speakers, please, I'd encourage you to take some time to fill out the Google survey that'll show up in the Zoom window right after this program, and also in a follow-up thank you email. And then finally, hope you'll join us next time for our Science in the Mountains lecture series. March 15th, we will have Mount Washington Avalanche Center Snow Ranger Pat Scanlon, who's going to talk to us all about avalanche forecasting in the presidential range of the White Mountains. And just added, on Big Wind Day, April 12th, we will have our very own weather observant engineer Sam Robinson and Summit Operations Director Rebecca Scholin presenting about the observatory's brand new custom designed anemometer, the next generation pitot anemometer, and that's on April 12th. So you can sign up over at mountwashington.org/SITM and also find any programs you may have missed in the past. Thank you again, Peter, for the presentation this evening. Thanks to all of you for joining, and we hope we'll see you next time. Have a great night. Thanks again, Peter.
All righty, thank you.
Take care. Bye, everybody.